There was a boy born with a blood clot in his fist, or so the legend tells us. Born under an endless sky on the grass-covered steppes where the wind carried voices across impossible distances. His father was poisoned when he was 9. His family was abandoned by their clan, left to starve on the frozen plains where winter could kill as easily as any blade. The boy survived by eating wild roots and fishing in ice-cold streams. He was captured, enslaved, escaped. He learned early that the world was cruel, that survival required cunning and strength in equal measure, and that loyalty was the rarest treasure of all. His name was Temüjin, but history would come to know him by another name, Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, the man who would unite the fractured Mongol tribes and forge them into the greatest land empire the world has ever seen. An empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna. An empire that connected east and west for the first time in history, making the Silk Road safe for merchants and ideas to flow freely. An empire built on blood and terror, yes, but also on merit, religious tolerance, and a sophisticated postal system that could carry messages faster than anything Europe would achieve for centuries. Tonight, as the world grows quiet and the day releases its hold on you, we invite you to journey back to the 13th century, to a time when a single man's vision reshaped 3 continents, to understand not just the conquest, but the connection, not just the destruction, but what was built in its wake. This is the story of how Genghis Khan connected the world, and whether that connection was a gift or a curse may depend on where you were standing when the Mongol riders appeared on the horizon. Now, let the story unfold. Let the steppes stretch out before you. Let the rhythm of hoofbeats on ancient grass carry you into the past. The year was 1162. Though such numbers meant nothing on the steppes, where time was measured in seasons and the cycles of herds moving across grasslands that seemed to have no end. Somewhere along the banks of the Onon River, in a felt tent that swayed gently with the wind, a woman named Hoylin gave birth to her first son. The midwives gasped when they saw him, not because he was weak or deformed, but because he emerged clutching something dark and solid in his tiny fist. A blood clot, large as a knucklebone, gripped tight, as if he'd been fighting even before he drew his first breath. The shamans were summoned. They circled the infant, chanting low, reading the signs the way others read tracks in snow. This child, they whispered, would be a warrior. This child would spill blood across distant lands. His father, Yasuge, a chieftain of the Borjigin clan, accepted this prophecy with quiet pride. He named the boy Temüjin, after a Tatar chief he had recently captured in battle. It was a fierce name, a name that tasted of victory. But names and omens, however powerful, cannot fill an empty belly or turn aside a poisoned cup. The steppes were beautiful and merciless in equal measure. In summer, the grasslands rolled green and gold under skies so vast they seemed to curve at the edges. Wild horses ran in thundering herds, their manes streaming like dark water. In winter, the same landscape became a white silence that could swallow whole families, where the wind cut through layered felt and fur, where livestock froze standing and families burned dried dung just to survive the night. This was the world that shaped Temüjin, not palaces or gardens, not books or temples, but endless sky and grass and the constant need to move, to adapt, to endure. His early childhood was normal enough for a chieftain's son. He learned to ride before he could properly walk, small hands gripping the mane of a gentle mare while his father led them across the plains. He learned to shoot, to track, to read weather in the color of clouds. He learned the songs and stories of his people, tales of ancestors and spirits, of wolves and eagles. He was betrothed at 9 years old to a girl named Berta from a neighboring clan.
a political alliance sealed with gifts and promises. His father led him to her family's camp, and on the journey home, everything changed.
Yasuge stopped to share a meal with a group of Tatars, old enemies, but the steppes demanded a certain hospitality even between rivals. They offered him fermented mare's milk, arag, and he drank because to refuse would be an insult. He didn't know it had been poisoned. By the time he reached home, the toxin was burning through him. He died slowly, in pain, calling for his eldest son, who was still days away. By the time young Temüjin returned, his father was already buried beneath the pile of stones on a hillside, and the world as he knew it had ended. A chieftain's power died with him unless his sons were old enough and strong enough to claim it. Temüjin was 9 years old. His younger brothers were even smaller. The Taichud clan, who should have protected Yasuge's widow and children, made a cold calculation instead. They took the herds, the best horses, the warriors who had followed Yasuge. They left Holin and her children with almost nothing. Winter was coming, and they were expected to die quietly, to disappear into the anonymous mass of the steppes' forgotten dead. But Holin was not a woman who disappeared quietly. She was an iron will wrapped in human skin, and she refused to let her children become bones scattered on the grass. When the clan abandoned them, she gathered her sons and her 2 stepsons, the children of Yasuge's other wife, and she led them away from the main camps into the wilderness. She taught them to survive on what others considered worthless. They dug in the hard earth for wild garlic and onions, roots that tasted bitter but filled the stomach. They caught fish in the cold rivers with their bare hands, standing knee-deep in water that numbed their legs. They shot marmots and mice and anything else that moved. Holin divided the meager food with fierce equality, and when her sons complained, she reminded them that they were descendants of the wolf and the deer, that their blood carried the strength of sky and earth. Shame, she told them, was lighter than hunger. Pride was a luxury for people with full bellies. They would do what they must to survive, and they would not break. Those years in the wilderness carved something fundamental into Temüjin's soul. He learned that the world was not fair, that birth and bloodline meant nothing without power to back them up. He learned that survival required ruthlessness, but also cunning, that sometimes you had to bend like grass in the wind, and sometimes you had to strike like a wolf at the throat. He also learned about loyalty, watching his mother refuse to abandon her stepchildren, even when feeding them meant her own sons ate less. He learned about resilience, seeing her stand upright year after year when most would have crumbled. These lessons sank deeper than any shaman's teaching, deeper than any chieftain's wisdom. They became the bedrock of everything he would build. But the hardest lesson was still to come, and it arrived in the form of his half-brother Begter. The 2 boys, Temüjin and Begter, had never been close. They competed for food, for their mother's attention, for the position of eldest male in a family that had lost its patriarch. One spring day, Temüjin and his full brother, Kasar, were fishing in a stream when Begter stole a fish they had caught, and later a lark they had shot with their small bows. It was a small theft, the kind that happens between brothers everywhere. But for children living on the edge of starvation, it was not small at all. That night, Temüjin made a decision. He took Kasar aside, and together they hunted Begter as they would hunt an animal. They found him sitting on a hillside watching the family's few remaining animals. They approached from different sides, arrows already nocked. Begter saw them coming and understood immediately what was happening. He didn't run. He sat still and made only one request, that they not do this in front of their mother, that they spare his younger full brother. Then he waited. The arrows flew. Begter fell. When Hoelin discovered what her sons had done, she was horrified and furious. She compared them to wild beasts, to monsters who destroyed their own kind. But she did not cast them out. Perhaps she understood in some deep and terrible way that this was what the world had made necessary. Kindness was a luxury. Mercy was for people with enough to share. Her sons had learned the lesson the steppes taught everyone eventually: hesitate and die. The murder of Begter brought consequences beyond Hoelin's anger. Word spread among the scattered clans that Yasuge's son was dangerous, unstable, someone to be watched. The Taichud, who had already dismissed the family as irrelevant, now saw Temüjin as a potential threat.
Better to eliminate him before he grew strong enough to seek revenge for his father's death and his family's abandonment. They came for him in the night, warriors on horseback surrounding the small camp. Temüjin ran into the forest, but they tracked him for days. Finally, exhausted and starving, he was captured. They locked his neck in a wooden kang, a heavy portable yoke that prevented him from lying down or bringing his hands to his face. He was paraded through the Temüjin camps as a warning to anyone who might think of defying clan authority. But captivity gave Temüjin time to observe, to listen, to learn. He saw how the Temüjin treated their own people, the petty cruelties of men who ruled through fear rather than respect. He memorized faces, noted who showed him kindness and who spat as he passed, and he waited.
The chance came during a feast, when his guards grew drunk on arag and the camp's attention turned to celebration. Temüjin, still wearing the kang, slipped away into the darkness. He hid in a river, submerging himself with only his face above water, while search parties passed within feet of where he lay. Cold seeped into his bones, his muscles cramped, but he stayed silent, barely breathing until the searchers moved on. When he finally emerged, shivering and desperate, he sought help from an unlikely source. A man named Sorkhan Shira from the Temüjin camp itself found him and chose mercy over loyalty to his clan. He hid Temüjin in a cart full of wool, risking his own life and his family's safety. Later, he helped the boy escape completely, sending him back toward his mother's camp with quiet words of encouragement. This act of unexpected kindness from a near stranger became another foundational lesson. Loyalty could cross clan lines, honor could exist even in enemies, and debts, whether of gratitude or revenge, should always be remembered and repaid. Temüjin returned to his family, but he was no longer the boy who had left. He was perhaps 15 years old, hardened by hunger and captivity, marked by the knowledge that he had killed and been hunted in return. But something else was growing in him now, something beyond mere survival. He began to see patterns in the chaos of steppe politics. He understood that the endless cycle of raids and counter-raids, of shifting alliances and blood feuds, kept the Mongol tribes weak and scattered. A strong clan could dominate for a generation, but then fragment when the chieftain died. Unity was temporary, always dissolving back into competition and conflict. What if it didn't have to be that way? What if loyalty could be built on something more stable than blood ties? What if merit mattered more than ancestry? These were dangerous thoughts, revolutionary in a world where your birth determined your destiny. But Temüjin had already broken the old rules by surviving when he should have died, by escaping when he should have remained captive. Why not break a few more? He began to gather followers, slowly at first. Other outcasts, young men with ambition but no inheritance, warriors tired of serving incompetent chiefs simply because of noble bloodlines. He offered them something radical, a place in a group where ability would be recognized, where loyalty would be rewarded, where a talented commoner could rise higher than a lazy aristocrat. This was not yet an army, barely even a proper clan, just a small band of men and their families, camped together, sharing what little they had. But it was a seed, and Temüjin tended it carefully. He remembered every slight he had suffered, yes, but he also remembered every kindness. He cultivated alliances through marriage and oaths of brotherhood. He proved himself in small raids, demonstrating both courage and tactical intelligence. Word began to spread across the steppes. Yesege's son had not only survived, but was becoming someone to reckon with, a young leader with unusual ideas and unusual luck. The night deepened around those campfires where Temüjin and his followers planned their future. The stars above the steppes were impossibly bright, undimmed by any city lights because there were no cities, only grass and sky and the scattered felt tents of nomadic people who had lived this way for countless generations. Temüjin, still just a young man, looked up at those stars and perhaps wondered how far his ambition could reach. He had been born holding blood. He had survived abandonment, starvation, murder, and captivity.
He had learned every lesson the harsh steppes could teach, and he had not broken. Now, with the first loyal followers gathered around him, with ideas forming that would shatter the old tribal order, with a vision of unity that seemed impossible but somehow inevitable, he stood at the beginning of something vast. He could not have known that his name would echo through 8 centuries of history. He could not have imagined that his descendants would rule from Korea to Hungary, that the empire he would build would be the largest continuous land empire ever known. He knew only that he refused to be a victim anymore, that he would either become strong enough to protect what mattered or die trying, and that the world as it existed, fragmented and cruel and random, could be changed by someone willing to be ruthless enough, smart enough, and visionary enough to impose a new order on the chaos. The boy with the blood clot had survived his childhood. Now the man he was becoming turned his eyes outward, beyond his small band of followers, beyond even the scattered Mongol tribes, toward a horizon that seemed to have no limit. And history, unknowing, held its breath.
The Mongol people were not one people but many. Dozens of tribes scattered across the endless grasslands, each with its own chieftain, its own grazing territories, its own ancient grievances against neighboring clans. The Taichiud, the Merkits, the Naimans, the Keraids, the Tartars who had poisoned Temüjin's father. All of them spoke dialects of the same language, followed the same seasonal migrations, worshipped the same eternal blue sky. And all of them had been killing each other for as long as anyone could remember, blood feuds passed from grandfather to grandson. A raid in spring demanded revenge in autumn. An insult at a wedding became a massacre a generation later. The cycle was endless, predictable, and it kept the Mongol tribes weak, fragmented, unable to threaten the great sedentary civilizations that surrounded them. The Chinese dynasties to the south barely noticed them, except as occasional nuisances. The Islamic empires to the west considered them primitive nomads, hardly worth diplomatic attention, and the tribes themselves seemed content, or at least resigned, to this state of perpetual low-level warfare. But Temüjin, now in his 20s, looked at this chaos and saw possibility. Where others saw tradition, he saw waste. Where others saw honor and endless revenge, he saw pointless death. And most radically of all, where others saw the natural order of aristocratic bloodlines determining who led and who followed, he saw a system that elevated mediocrities and wasted talent. His own small following was growing, but growth brought danger. The more visible he became, the more he threatened the established order. Other chieftains began to notice this young upstart who welcomed anyone into his ranks regardless of birth, who promoted men based on ability rather than ancestry, who spoke of unity and merit in ways that sounded almost seditious to traditional ears. They formed coalitions against him, temporary alliances between tribes that normally hated each other, united only in their desire to crush this dangerous innovator before his ideas spread too far. The battles that followed were small at first, skirmishes over horses or grazing rights, the normal violence of steppe life. But Temüjin fought them differently. He studied his enemies, learned their patterns, their weaknesses. He used intelligence, sending scouts far ahead, gathering information while his opponents relied on courage and tradition. He was willing to retreat when outnumbered, to give ground and wait for better conditions, a pragmatism that some called cowardice, but which kept his core followers alive. And after each victory, no matter how small, he did something unexpected. He offered the defeated warriors a choice: swear true loyalty to him, accept that merit would determine rank, and join his growing confederation, or refuse and face execution. Many chose loyalty, and Temüjin held them to it, but he also rewarded it, giving them status and opportunity they could never have achieved in their birth tribes. The first major alliance came through an old connection. When Temüjin was young, his father Yasuge had been blood brother to Togrul, Khan of the Karaid tribe, one of the most powerful confederations on the steppes. Temüjin sought out this man, now called Ung Khan, and reminded him of the oath sworn years before. He offered service and loyalty in exchange for protection and legitimacy. Togrul, seeing potential advantage in this capable young warrior, agreed.
The alliance gave Temüjin breathing room, the backing of an established power, time to consolidate and grow. But it was also a relationship balanced on the edge of a knife, because Temüjin was building something that would eventually overshadow his patron, and both men knew it, though neither spoke the truth aloud. With Cariad's support, Temüjin began to absorb smaller clans, one by one. The process was methodical, almost scientific. Identify a weak tribe, apply pressure through raids or the threat of raids, offer generous terms for submission, destroy utterly those who refused. The reputation he was building became a weapon in itself. Stories spread across the steppes of a leader who never forgot loyalty or betrayal, who rewarded service lavishly but punished disloyalty with absolute finality. Then came the crisis that would define him. The Merkits, remembering an old grievance against Temüjin's father, raided his camp and kidnapped his wife Berta, the girl he had been betrothed to as a child and finally married. This was not just personal trauma, but political humiliation, a direct challenge to his authority and his ability to protect what was his. Temüjin's response revealed both his tactical intelligence and his capacity for cold fury. He assembled a coalition, calling on Togrul and on another ally, Jamuka, a childhood friend who led his own tribal confederation. Together, they launched a devastating counter-raid against the Merkits. They struck at dawn, horsemen appearing out of the morning mist like spirits, surrounding the Merkit camps before any alarm could be raised. The battle was swift and brutal. The Merkits were scattered, their chieftains killed or captured, their people absorbed. And Berta was recovered, pregnant, which meant she had been with the Merkits for months. Temüjin accepted her back without hesitation and claimed the child as his own, a choice that spoke volumes about his priorities. The personal violation mattered less than the restoration of order and the message sent to anyone who might think him weak. But it also showed something else, a capacity for loyalty and pragmatism intertwined, a willingness to set aside questions of honor when they conflicted with larger goals. The alliance with Jamuka was always uneasy, built on childhood affection but strained by adult ambition. Jamuka was charismatic, a gifted warrior and poet, beloved by traditional aristocrats who saw him as a proper chieftain from a noble bloodline. Temüjin was the opposite, a man who had clawed his way up from nothing, who elevated commoners and preached merit, who represented a threat to the old order. For a time they rode together, two rising powers on the steppes, complementary in their strengths. But the relationship carried the seeds of its own destruction because both men understood that the steppes were not large enough for two visions of the future. The break came over something small, as it often does, a dispute over camping arrangements, an insult perceived or imagined, details that history is blurred. What matters is that Jamuka and Temüjin parted ways, and the parting made them enemies. The war between them would drag on for years, a conflict not just between two men, but between two ideas of how the Mongol world should be organized. Jamuka represented tradition, the old aristocratic order where birth determined destiny and the noble clans held unquestioned authority. Temüjin represented revolution, the radical notion that talent mattered more than ancestry, that loyalty transcended bloodlines. The battles were vicious and personal. At one point, Jamuka captured several dozen of Temüjin's followers and had them boiled alive in great cauldrons, a horror designed to break morale and spread terror. But the strategy backfired. The gruesome executions only strengthened the loyalty of Temüjin's remaining followers, who saw in his meritocratic system a protection against such arbitrary cruelty. If you proved your worth, if you gave true loyalty, Temüjin would stand by you regardless of your birth. Jamuka, for all his charisma and noble blood, was revealing himself as just another tribal chieftain, willing to torture and kill on whim. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the balance of power shifted. Clans that had supported Jamuka began to defect. Warriors disillusioned with the old system found their way to Temüjin's camps. Even some of Jamuka's own followers, seeing which way the wind was blowing, chose to switch sides. And Temüjin, with each defection, each small victory, each successful raid, was learning the arts of leadership at a level beyond mere tactics. He was learning how to build institutions, how to create systems that would survive beyond individual personalities. He organized his growing army in a way that broke tribal lines. The traditional structure of steppe warfare was clan-based. You fought alongside your relatives, under chiefs chosen by birth. Temüjin shattered this system and rebuilt it on decimal principles. Units of 10 men called an arban, 10 arbans made 100 called a jagun, 10 jaguns made 1,000, a mingan, 10 mingans made a tumen, 10,000, the largest operational unit. Commanders were chosen for competence, not bloodline. A talented son of a blacksmith could command aristocrats if he proved his ability. This reorganization served multiple purposes. It created a unified military structure where orders could flow cleanly from top to bottom. It broke up tribal loyalties that might split the army along clan lines. And it sent a clear message that the old world was dying, that something new was being born in the blood and dust of the steppes. The decimal system would become one of Genghis Khan's most enduring innovations, copied by armies across Asia and eventually reaching Europe. But in these early years, it was simply a practical solution to the problem of commanding diverse followers who had no natural loyalty to each other except through him. The relationship with Togrul, the Kariid Khan who had been Temüjin's patron, also eventually ruptured. As Temüjin grew stronger, Togrul grew suspicious. His advisors whispered that the protege was becoming more powerful than the patron, that Temüjin's innovations and growing confederation represented a threat to all traditional authority, including Togrul's own. A plot was hatched to eliminate Temüjin before he could overshadow the Kariid Khan completely. But Temüjin had built a network of intelligence gatherers, and word of the betrayal reached him in time. The confrontation was inevitable and decisive. Temüjin struck first, attacking the Kariid Confederation before they could fully organize against him. The campaign was brutal and efficient. Within months, the Kariid were broken. Togrul fled and died in obscurity. His people were absorbed into Temüjin's growing empire. The pattern was repeating, accelerating. Challenge Temüjin and be destroyed. Submit to him and be welcomed, rewarded, integrated. The choice was stark, and increasingly tribes chose survival and opportunity over suicidal defense of the old ways. By the early years of the 13th century, Temüjin had defeated or absorbed nearly all the major tribal confederations. The Tatars who had killed his father were conquered with particular thoroughness. Every male taller than a cart axle was executed, a genocidal revenge that eliminated the tribe as a political entity. The Naimans, powerful and sophisticated with their own written script and Buddhist influences, fell after fierce resistance. The Merkits were scattered to the winds. Jamuka, his old friend and rival, was finally captured by his own followers and handed over as a peace offering. Temüjin offered him mercy, offered to restore their friendship, but Jamuka refused. He asked instead for a noble death, to be killed without spilling his blood, to have his bones laid to rest on a high place. Temüjin granted this request, having his old friend's back broken, a death that kept the blood inside the body as tradition demanded for nobility. It was a moment of genuine tragedy, the end of a friendship destroyed by ambition and incompatible visions. Two men who might have been brothers if the world had been different, if the steppes had been large enough for both their dreams.
In the spring of 1206, the surviving Mongol chieftains gathered for a great assembly beside the Anan River, the same river where Temüjin had been born 44 years earlier. This Kurultai, this gathering of clans, was unlike any that had come before. The assembled chiefs represented not independent tribes, but components of a unified whole, a confederation that spanned the steppes from forest to desert. They had come to acknowledge what everyone already knew, that the scattered Mongol tribes no longer existed as separate entities, that they had been forged into a single people, that the man who had accomplished this impossible unification deserved a title equal to his achievement. They declared Temüjin the Great Khan, the supreme ruler. But more than that, they gave him a new name,
a title that meant universal ruler, oceanic ruler, a name that carried the weight of sky and earth. Genghis Khan. The boy born clutching blood had become the man who held the reins of an entire people. The outcast who had survived by eating roots and fighting for every scrap now commanded the largest cavalry force the steppes had ever seen. The prisoner who had escaped the Kang now wore the white horsehair standard that marked supreme authority. But Genghis Khan understood that military conquest was only the beginning. A unified people needed unified law. He proclaimed the Yasa, a law code that would govern Mongol society. The exact details of the Yasa have been lost to history, preserved only in fragments and later accounts, but its principles were clear. Loyalty was the highest virtue. Betrayal was the greatest crime. Religious tolerance would be absolute. No one could be persecuted for their faith. Theft was punishable by death. Adultery was punishable by death. The Yasa was harsh by any standard, but it was also universal. It applied to everyone, from the lowliest herder to the Khan himself. There were no exemptions for nobility. The law was the law, and it would be enforced with iron consistency. This legal framework transformed the Mongol Confederation from a military alliance into a true state, a political entity with institutions that could survive beyond any individual leader. Genghis Khan also organized the administration that would govern the empire. He appointed 4 great generals, his most trusted commanders, each given responsibility for a tumen, 10,000 warriors. He established an elite guard, the Keshig, composed of the sons of commanders and chieftains, who served both as bodyguards and as hostages, ensuring their father's loyalty. He created a courier system, the Yam, that could carry messages across vast distances with remarkable speed, a network of relay stations where riders could change horses and rest before continuing their journey.
As the Kurultai concluded and the assembled clans began to disperse back to their grazing lands, now united under a single authority for the first time in memory, a strange energy hung in the air. Something had shifted, some fundamental reordering of reality. The Mongol people, who had existed for centuries as feuding tribes on the periphery of civilization, had become an organized force under a single vision, and that vision was ambitious beyond anything the world had seen. Genghis Khan had unified the steppes, yes, but the steppes were just the beginning, just the foundation. Beyond the grasslands lay wealthy civilizations, ancient kingdoms with cities and gold, with technologies and knowledge that the nomads lacked. The Zi Shah to the south, the Jin dynasty of northern China, the Khwarezmian Empire stretching across Central Asia. These great powers had barely noticed the tribal conflicts among the Mongol clans, had viewed the steppe nomads as useful sometimes as mercenaries or trading partners, dangerous sometimes as raiders, but never as an existential threat. They were about to discover their mistake. The unified Mongol Confederation, battle-hardened by decades of internal warfare, organized with unprecedented efficiency, led by a strategic genius who had proven himself in 100 desperate struggles, was coiled like a spring, all that violent potential aimed outward now, ready to be released on a world that had no idea what was coming. And Genghis Khan, standing beneath the eternal blue sky that his people worshipped, looking out across the assembled thousands who had sworn to follow him to the ends of the earth, must have felt the weight of destiny settling onto his shoulders. He had survived when he should have died. He had unified what everyone said could not be unified. He had taken a fractured people and forged them into a weapon that would cut through empires. The night was deep now and quiet, and the stars above the steppes burned with a light that seemed to promise impossible things. The boy with the blood clot had become the universal ruler, and his journey, improbable and brutal and visionary, was only just beginning. History held its breath. The world, unknowing, turned toward the dawn that would bring the Mongol conquest. And somewhere in the darkness, hoofbeats echoed like distant thunder, the sound of something vast and unstoppable beginning to move. The conquests began. Now the Mongol war machine turned outward, and the world would never be the same. For centuries, the great sedentary civilizations had viewed the steppe nomads with a mixture of contempt and wary respect. They were useful as mercenaries, dangerous as raiders, but never truly threatening to the established order of walled cities and agricultural empires. The nomads could sweep across the grasslands with terrifying speed, yes, but they broke against stone walls like waves against cliffs. Cities were fortresses. Siege warfare required technology, patience, engineering knowledge that the horse peoples had never possessed. This calculus had held true for so long that it seemed like a law of nature. But Genghis Khan was about to rewrite that law, and the first lesson would be taught to the Shah kingdom, a realm that controlled the western corridor along the edge of the Gobi Desert, a wealthy state built on trade and irrigation, protected by walled cities that had never fallen to nomadic assault. In 1209, Genghis Khan led his unified Mongol army south, and the world's education in Mongol methods began. The Shah campaign was a proving ground, a test of whether the Mongols could transcend their limitations and become more than just raiders. The first cities they encountered presented immediate problems: high walls, defended gates, populations that could retreat inside and wait out a siege, while the nomad army, with no supply lines and no siege equipment, would eventually have to withdraw or starve. Traditional steppe tactics were useless here. You couldn't charge a wall on horseback, you couldn't shoot it full of arrows and expect it to fall. Genghis Khan could have retreated, could have accepted that his power was limited to the open steppes. Instead, he adapted. He began to conscript engineers from among his Chinese subjects and prisoners, men who knew the secrets of siege warfare, who understood counterweights and torsion and the mathematics of projectile motion. He set them to work building catapults, siege towers, battering rams, all the medieval technology of wall breaking. The Mongols, who had lived their entire lives on horseback, who had never built a permanent structure larger than a felt tent, became students of engineering. They learned quickly, because failure meant death, and success meant wealth and power. The first Shah cities fell, and with each victory the Mongols refined their techniques, added new methods to their arsenal. But the campaign also revealed something else about Genghis Khan's approach to conquest. He understood that terror could be as effective as siege weapons, that the right kind of brutality could make future battles unnecessary. Cities that resisted were treated with calculated savagery. The populations were sometimes massacred, sometimes enslaved, the buildings burned, the irrigation systems destroyed. But cities that surrendered immediately, that opened their gates and offered tribute without resistance, were often spared the worst violence. Their leaders were confirmed in power as vassals, their populations were protected. This created a cruel calculus for the next city in the Mongols' path: resist and die, or submit and survive. Many chose survival, and the Mongol advance accelerated as reputation preceded the army. Word spread faster than the horsemen could ride. Stories of cities vanishing, of populations exterminated, of defenders impaled or used as human shields in subsequent sieges. The psychological weapon of terror, deployed with cold precision, began to do the work that siege engines alone could never accomplish. The Shah kingdom, which had stood for 2 centuries, collapsed within a few years. By 1210, they were tributary vassals, paying annual tribute in goods and camels and promises of allegiance. Genghis Khan had proven the concept. The Mongols could take cities. They could absorb new technologies and methods with startling speed. And they could terrorize civilizations into submission through a mixture of military effectiveness and carefully managed atrocity. The lesson learned, he turned his attention to a far greater prize. The Jin dynasty controlled northern China, the ancient heartland of Chinese civilization, home to millions of people and cities that made the Shah settlements look like villages. This would be a different order of challenge entirely, a war that would drag on for decades and consume resources beyond anything the Mongols had yet attempted. But Genghis Khan was patient when patience served his purpose, and he understood that destroying the Jin would require sustained effort, multiple campaigns, a willingness to accept setbacks and learn from them. The war began in 1211 and immediately demonstrated both Mongol strengths and limitations.
In the open field, Jin armies were swept aside with almost contemptuous ease. Mongol cavalry tactics, refined through generations of tribal warfare, were simply superior to anything the Jin could field. Mobility, firepower from composite bows, discipline, the ability to feign retreat and then wheel around to surround pursuers, all of these gave the Mongols overwhelming advantage in any battle that wasn't constrained by walls.
But Beijing, the Jin capital, was one of the greatest fortified cities in the world, protected by massive walls and supplied by a hinterland rich enough to outlast any siege. The Mongols settled in for a prolonged investment of the city, applying pressure, cutting supply lines, but also continuing to campaign across the Jin territories, taking lesser cities, gathering resources, slowly strangling the dynasty. The siege of Beijing dragged on for years, testing Mongol patience and organizational capacity. Genghis Khan himself eventually withdrew to deal with other matters, leaving his generals to continue the pressure. Finally, in 1215, the city fell through a combination of starvation, internal betrayal, and the sheer relentlessness of Mongol siege tactics that had grown ever more sophisticated. The sack of Beijing was thorough and terrible, a month of fire and slaughter that left the great city a smoldering ruin. The Jin dynasty survived in reduced form for another 2 decades, but its power was broken. Northern China, the economic engine that had supported Chinese civilization for millennia, now paid tribute to Mongol overlords. The wealth that flowed from this conquest transformed the Mongol Confederation from a steppe power into something approaching a true empire, with resources that could support permanent administration, sustained military campaigns, and the Khan's increasingly ambitious vision. But the conquest that would truly announce the Mongols to the world, that would send shockwaves across continents and cement Genghis Khan's reputation as one of history's greatest and most terrifying conquerors, began not from deliberate aggression, but from miscalculation and insult. To the west of the Mongol territories lay the Khwarezmian Empire, a vast Muslim state that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Aral Sea, rich in cities and trade, ruled by Sultan Muhammad II, a capable but arrogant leader who had never encountered the Mongols and had no reason to fear nomads from distant steppes. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a caravan to establish trade relations, a peaceful gesture accompanied by letters addressing the Sultan as an equal, proposing commerce and mutual respect. The caravan reached the city of Otrar, where the governor, a man named Inalchuk, made a decision that would cost millions of lives. He seized the caravan's goods and executed the merchants as spies. Whether he acted on his own authority or with the Sultan's approval remains unclear, but the result was the same. Word reached Genghis Khan that his ambassadors had been murdered and his peaceful overture spat upon. The Khan's response followed the protocols of the steppes. He sent 3 ambassadors to Sultan Muhammad, demanding that the governor of Otrar be handed over for punishment, seeking justice for the murdered merchants. Sultan Muhammad's response was catastrophic in its stupidity. He had the chief ambassador killed and sent the other 2 back with their beards burned off, an insult so profound that it left no room for anything but war. And this would not be a war of conquest for territory or resources. This would be a war of annihilation, a punishment so complete and devastating that it would stand as a warning to every other power that might think of insulting Mongol ambassadors. Genghis Khan assembled his army, now numbering perhaps 150,000 warriors, augmented by Chinese siege engineers and a logistics train that could support extended campaigns far from the steppes. In 1219, the Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire began, and with it came a level of destruction that would scar the Islamic world for centuries. The campaign was systematic, almost scientific in its thoroughness. The Mongols divided into multiple columns, striking across a front so wide that the Khwarezmian forces couldn't concentrate to meet them. Cities fell in sequence, each one a lesson in what happened when you resisted the Mongol advance. Bukhara, one of the great centers of Islamic learning, was taken after fierce fighting.
Genghis Khan himself reportedly rode into the main mosque and declared to the assembled nobles that he was the flail of God, sent to punish them for their sins. Whether he actually said this or whether later chroniclers invented the speech, it captures the apocalyptic nature of what was happening. The city's scholars and craftsmen were separated out and spared. Everyone else faced a darker fate. The men were conscripted to serve as human shields in the next siege. The women were distributed among the Mongol soldiers. The city itself was systematically looted and then burned. Samarkand, even greater than Bukhara, even more beautiful, held out for only a few days before its garrison fled and the city surrendered. The Mongols promised mercy, then reneged, massacring perhaps 50,000 soldiers who had laid down their arms. The civilian population was largely spared, but the message was clear: surrender bought you nothing if the Mongols decided otherwise. Merv, called the Queen of Cities, refused to submit and was erased from existence. The siege was brief, the defenses overcome through engineering and relentless assault, and then came the killing. The Mongol generals divided the population among the army units, assigning each soldier a quota of executions. Hundreds, perhaps as many as 1 million people, were systematically murdered over several days. The city's infrastructure, its famous library, its irrigation systems that had turned desert into garden, all were destroyed. The rubble was scattered and the ground was plowed with salt so nothing would grow. Merv, which had been one of the greatest cities of the Islamic world, ceased to exist. Its ruins would remain abandoned for centuries, a monument to the price of resistance. Nishapur suffered perhaps the worst fate of all. When a Mongol prince was killed during the siege, his widow requested that no living thing be spared when the city fell. The Mongols obliged. Every human was killed, every dog, every cat, every animal within the walls. The heads of the dead were piled in pyramids, sorted by gender, a grotesque counting of complete annihilation. Even the surrounding farmland was destroyed, the irrigation channels filled in, the orchards burned.
The scale of destruction was unprecedented, and it served multiple purposes. It was revenge, certainly, for the murdered merchants and insulted ambassadors. It was terror, a message to every other city that resistance meant extinction. But it was also a kind of perverted efficiency. Each city destroyed with maximum brutality made the next city more likely to surrender without a fight, which saved Mongol lives and resources. The cruelty was calculated, not random. Sultan Muhammad fled before the Mongol advance, abandoning his cities and his people, pursued by a Mongol flying column led by 2 of Genghis Khan's best generals, Subutai and Jebe. They chased him for months across Persia, through the Caucasus, into the steppes beyond. Muhammad died on an island in the Caspian Sea, broken and alone, his empire shattered behind him. His son, Jalaluddin, fought on for a time, even winning occasional victories, but he could not reverse the tide. By 1222, the Khwarezmian Empire existed only in memory, its cities ruins, its population decimated, its territory absorbed into the Mongol realm. But beneath this overwhelming violence, something more complex was also happening. Genghis Khan was not simply destroying, he was also building, collecting, integrating. In every conquered city, the Mongols separated out skilled craftsmen, scholars, engineers, administrators. These people were relocated to Mongol territory, their knowledge and skills preserved and exploited. Chinese engineers taught siege warfare. Persian administrators helped organize taxation systems. Muslim scholars were consulted on astronomy and medicine. The Mongols, who had been nomadic herders just decades before, were becoming sophisticated empire builders, absorbing the accumulated knowledge of every civilization they conquered. Religious tolerance was not just permitted, but enforced. Genghis Khan had declared that all religions were valid paths to the divine, that shamans and priests and imams all served the same ultimate spiritual purpose. Christian churches stood beside Muslim mosques in Mongol-controlled cities. Buddhist monasteries received protection. Religious leaders were exempted from taxation, and religious persecution was punishable by death. This wasn't enlightened tolerance in the modern sense, it was pragmatic imperial policy. A diverse empire required religious peace, and imposing steppe shamanism on sophisticated urban populations would only breed resistance. The postal system, the yam, was extended across the conquered territories, creating a communications network that could move messages from one end of the empire to the other faster than anything the world had seen. Relay stations were established every 20 to 30 miles, with fresh horses and supplies ready for couriers carrying the Khan's seal. A message could travel from Mongolia to Persia in a matter of weeks, allowing centralized control over vast distances. Trade flourished along routes protected by Mongol authority. The Silk Road, which had been dangerous and fragmented, broken up by competing states and roving bandits, became safer than it had been in centuries. Merchants could travel from China to the Mediterranean under a single legal framework, protected by Yasa law that made theft punishable by death. The violence and the construction existed simultaneously, two faces of the same imperial project. The Mongols destroyed anything that resisted them, but they preserved and protected anything useful that submitted. The choice was stark and terrible, but it was at least a choice, and increasingly, rulers across Asia were choosing submission over annihilation. By the early 1220s, Genghis Khan was in his 60s, an age when most men slowed down, when they enjoyed grandchildren and remembered past glories. But he showed no signs of stopping, no intention of settling into peaceful retirement. He was still personally leading campaigns, still sleeping in a tent and riding for days across harsh terrain, still planning the next conquest. The Tangut kingdom of Xixia, which had submitted years before but then rebelled, insulting Mongol authority by refusing to send troops to support the Khwarezmian campaign. This betrayal demanded punishment, and Genghis Khan led the final campaign himself despite failing health. What drove him at this stage? Was it simple momentum, the inability to stop after a lifetime of conquest? Was it the need to secure his empire, to establish borders so clearly defined and defended that they would hold after his death? Or was it something deeper, a genuine vision of a unified world where Mongol law prevented the chaos and bloodshed he had known as a child, where trade and ideas could flow freely under the protection of overwhelming military power? Perhaps all of these, intertwined and inseparable. The night deepened across the steppes and the cities and the empire that now stretched farther than any one man could travel in a lifetime. Genghis Khan, old now and feeling mortality approach, looked out across territories that had been reshaped by his will and his army's ferocity. He had connected the world through conquest, had made distant civilizations aware of each other through the simple fact that they all now paid tribute to the same Khan. The Silk Road functioned again, safer and more traveled than it had been centuries. Ideas moved along those roads as surely as silk and spices. Chinese innovations began to reach the West. Islamic mathematics and astronomy influenced Mongol administration. The isolation that had defined previous eras was breaking down, and whether this was progress or catastrophe depended entirely on your perspective. For the millions dead, for the cities that had become ruins, it was apocalypse. For the merchants who could now trade freely, for the scholars who could travel and exchange ideas, for the craftsmen whose skills were valued regardless of their origin, it was opportunity. Both things were true simultaneously, and history would struggle to hold both in mind, would swing between condemning Genghis Khan as a monster and praising him as a visionary, unable to reconcile the destruction and the connection, the terror and the trade. But the man himself, sitting in his tent as age crept through his bones, perhaps understood that these were not contradictions, but consequences, that the world he had forged through overwhelming violence had also created unprecedented unity, and that both would be his legacy, inseparable and eternal. The blood and the bridge, the destroyer and the connector, the nightmare and the dream that changed everything. And as sleep approached, as this chapter of his story closed, the hoofbeats of Mongol cavalry still echoed across distant lands, carrying his authority to the farthest edges of the known world, building an empire that would outlive him and reshape the course of human history in ways he could never have fully imagined. In the summer of 1227, while campaigning against the Xixia kingdom that had dared to rebel after years of submission, Genghis Khan fell from his horse during a hunt. The injury was not immediately fatal, but he was 65 years old, and his body, which had endured decades of warfare and harsh steppe winters and wounds that would have killed lesser men, was finally reaching its limits. Fever set in. Weakness followed.
His generals urged him to withdraw, to return to Mongolia and recover, but he refused. The Xijia had betrayed their oaths, and betrayal demanded punishment regardless of personal cost. He continued the campaign from a litter, directing sieges and strategy while his strength ebbed away like water into sand. The Xijia capital fell, and Genghis Khan ordered its complete destruction. Every building leveled, every member of the royal family executed, the kingdom itself erased so thoroughly that it would never rise again. It was his final act of terrible justice, the last demonstration that Mongol law applied to everyone, that oaths sworn could not be broken without consequence. And then, in late August, in a tent somewhere in the conquered Xijia territories, surrounded by his sons and closest generals, Genghis Khan died. The exact circumstances remain unclear, wrapped in the deliberate mystery that his followers created. What is certain is that the man who had reshaped the world, who had unified the Mongol tribes and conquered an empire larger than Rome at its height, passed from life as quietly as he had entered it, born in a felt tent, dying in one, the circle complete. His death was kept secret for months. The campaign was still ongoing, and any sign of weakness might encourage rebellion or fracture the unity he had spent a lifetime building. His body was carried back to Mongolia in absolute secrecy. According to some accounts, anyone who encountered the funeral procession was killed to preserve the secret, entire villages erased simply because they happened to be on the route home. Whether this is true or exaggeration, it speaks to the fear and awe that surrounded even his death. He was buried somewhere in the Henti Mountains, probably near his birthplace on the Onan River, in an unmarked grave that his followers deliberately concealed. Trees were planted over the site. A river was reportedly diverted to flow over it. The slaves who dug the grave were executed, and the soldiers who executed them were themselves killed, layers of secrecy designed to ensure that no one would ever disturb the Khan's rest. To this day, despite modern technology and countless expeditions, the exact location of Genghis Khan's tomb remains unknown, a final mystery that even 8 centuries cannot solve.
But if his burial place was hidden, his legacy was unavoidable and everywhere. Before his death, Genghis Khan had divided his empire among his 4 sons from his first wife Borte, following Mongol tradition that gave portions to each son while designating one as supreme ruler. The youngest, Temüjin, received the traditional Mongol heartland, the ancestral territories where the Khan's own household would continue. Chagatai received Central Asia, the conquered territories of the Khwarezmian Empire. Jochi, whose paternity had always been questioned because he was born after Borte's captivity among the Merkits, was given the Western Steppes, territories that stretched toward Europe, though he died before his father, and his son Batu would inherit instead. And Egedei, the 3rd son, affable and capable if somewhat too fond of drink, was designated as the Great Khan, the supreme ruler who would hold the empire together. This was not a division in the European sense, not a splitting of inheritance that created rival kingdoms. The Mongol Empire remained theoretically unified, with Egedei as the paramount leader and his brothers ruling their territories as subordinate khans who owed him ultimate allegiance. The system worked, for a time, because the momentum of conquest continued, because there were still rich kingdoms to plunder and glory to win, because expansion provided enough wealth and opportunity to satisfy all the branches of the family.
Ogedei proved to be a worthy successor in his own way, lacking his father's martial genius, but possessing administrative skills and a more generous temperament that made him effective at managing the competing interests within the Mongol elite. He established a permanent capital at Karakorum in central Mongolia, the first fixed city the Mongols had ever built, a statement that they were no longer just nomadic raiders, but a true empire with institutions and permanence. The city was cosmopolitan beyond anything the steppes had seen, with mosques and churches and Buddhist temples standing side by side, with quarters for Chinese craftsmen and Persian merchants and European captives, a miniature version of the larger empire's diversity. Under Ogedei's reign, the conquests continued and even accelerated. The wars in China ground forward, the Jin dynasty finally collapsing completely in 1234, northern China fully absorbed into Mongol control. But the most dramatic expansion came in the west, where Batu Khan, Jochi's son, led a massive invasion into the Russian principalities and beyond into Europe itself. The campaign began in 1237 and unfolded like a nightmare for the Christian kingdoms of the north. The Russian cities, wealthy from trade but divided by princely rivalries, fell one after another in the brutal winter campaigns that the Mongols somehow thrived in while European armies foundered. Ryazan was taken and burned. Vladimir fell after desperate resistance. Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, ancient and proud, was besieged in 1240 and destroyed so completely that it would take centuries to recover. The Mongols employed their standard tactics, offering surrender and reasonable terms to cities that submitted immediately and total destruction to those that resisted. Most resisted, trusting in their walls and their Christian God, and most were destroyed for it. The chronicles from this period are filled with apocalyptic language, describing the Mongols as devils sent to punish Christian sins, as harbingers of the end times. The psychological trauma of the Mongol invasion would scar Russian consciousness for generations, creating a cultural memory of vulnerability from the East that would influence Russian policy and paranoia for centuries to come. After subduing Russia, Batu pushed further west into Poland and Hungary. Europe, hearing reports of a vast barbarian horde approaching, mobilized its feudal armies with a mixture of confidence and terror. The Polish and German forces met the Mongols at Legnica in 1241 and were annihilated. The Mongol tactics, the feigned retreats and encirclements, the superior mobility and discipline proved overwhelming. Thousands of European knights died, and the Mongols reportedly filled 9 sacks with the severed ears of the dead as trophies.
Meanwhile, another Mongol army defeated the Hungarians at Mohi, using similar tactics to destroy a much larger force. The road to Vienna, to the heart of Europe, lay open. The continent held its breath, prepared for the same devastation that had consumed the Islamic world and Russia. And then, inexplicably, the Mongols withdrew. The reason was simple but profound. News arrived that Ögedei Khan had died back in Mongolia, and Mongol law required all princes to return to the homeland for the Kurultai that would elect the next great Khan. Batu turned his army around and headed east, and Europe was spared, not through military victory but through the accident of timing and the Mongol adherence to their own laws of succession. The brief Mongol presence in Europe would become legend, tales told and retold and exaggerated, contributing to the image of the Mongols as supernatural enemies. But the real empire was elsewhere, stretching from Korea to Poland, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. And across this vast territory, something remarkable was beginning to happen beneath the surface of conquest and administration. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, was creating conditions for exchange that the world had never seen. The Mongol approach to governance was surprisingly hands-off in many respects. They didn't try to impose their language, their religion, or their customs on conquered peoples. Local rulers who submitted were often left in place as vassals, required to pay tribute and provide troops when called upon, but otherwise free to govern their territories as they saw fit. What the Mongols did enforce absolutely was order. Banditry was suppressed with extreme prejudice, trade routes were protected. The Yam system, the postal relay network, now stretched across the entire empire, allowing messages and goods to move with unprecedented speed and security. A merchant could travel from Beijing to Baghdad or from Moscow to Samarkand, carrying a Mongol paisa, a tablet of authority, and be guaranteed safe passage and assistance at every relay station. This was revolutionary. For the first time in history, the Silk Road was truly safe, governed by a single authority whose reach extended across its entire length. Trade exploded as a result. Chinese silk flowed west in unprecedented quantities. Persian and Central Asian goods moved east. European merchants, most famously the Polo family from Venice, made the long journey to the court of the Great Khan and returned with tales that seemed almost fantastical to their countrymen. Marco Polo's account of his travels, though probably embellished and possibly incorporating stories he'd heard rather than places he'd actually visited, opened European eyes to the wealth and sophistication of the East in ways that would eventually help spark the age of exploration.
But more important than goods were ideas. Technologies and knowledge that had been isolated in one part of Eurasia began to spread. Gunpowder, invented in China, traveled west along Mongol-controlled routes and would eventually transform European warfare. Paper money, another Chinese innovation, was observed and studied by travelers, even if it didn't take root in Europe for centuries. Printing technology, the compass, advanced mathematics and astronomy from the Islamic world, all of these circulated more freely than ever before because the Mongol Empire had created a unified political space where such exchange was not just possible but encouraged. The Mongols themselves were collectors of knowledge, bringing craftsmen and scholars from every conquered territory to their courts, creating environments where Chinese engineers worked alongside Persian astronomers and European artisans. The genetic legacy was equally profound, though this would only be discovered centuries later through DNA analysis. Genghis Khan and his sons and grandsons, ruling over vast territories and taking many wives and concubines, left genetic traces that persist to this day. Modern studies suggest that roughly 1 in 200 men alive today, about 16 million people, carry Y chromosome markers that trace back to Genghis Khan and his close male relatives. This is a biological echo of empire, a genetic monument to conquest that dwarfs anything built in stone. Yet the empire that created this unprecedented connection was also responsible for unprecedented destruction. The death toll from the Mongol conquests remains uncertain, but estimates range from 30 to 40 million people, perhaps 10% of the world's total population at the time. Entire regions were depopulated. Cities that had stood for centuries vanished. The irrigation systems of Central Asia, built over millennia, were destroyed and would never be fully restored, turning productive agricultural land back into desert. The cultural and scientific heritage of the Islamic Golden Age, preserved in libraries and scholarly institutions, was burned or scattered. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258 under Genghis Khan's grandson Hulagu, the Abbasid Caliphate that had ruled the Islamic world for 5 centuries was extinguished. The House of Wisdom, repository of countless irreplaceable manuscripts, was destroyed, its books reportedly thrown into the Tigris in such quantities that the river ran black with ink. Scholars were killed, astronomical instruments smashed, a civilizational heritage reduced to rubble and memory. This is the paradox at the heart of the Mongol legacy, and there is no easy way to resolve it. The same empire that connected East and West, that made the Silk Road safe, that allowed unprecedented exchange of ideas and technologies, was built on a foundation of skulls. The same rulers who practiced religious tolerance and meritocracy also ordered genocides. The same legal system that prevented theft and protected merchants also mandated collective punishment for rebellion and execution for adultery.
Can the connection justify the conquest? Can the exchange of ideas balance against the loss of lives and the destruction of civilizations? History offers no clear answer, only the uncomfortable truth that both are real, that the Mongol Empire was simultaneously one of the greatest civilizing forces and one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. From the perspective of a Chinese merchant traveling safely to Persia, or a Persian scholar invited to the Khan's court, or a craftsman whose skills were valued regardless of his origin or religion, the Mongol Empire represented opportunity and order. From the perspective of a survivor of Nishapur or Merv or Kiev, watching their city burn and their family murdered, it represented nothing but horror. Both perspectives are valid, both are true. And perhaps that's the most important lesson the Mongol story teaches, that history is not simple, that the same events can be liberation for some and apocalypse for others, that progress and destruction are often two names for the same process, and that the world we inherit is always built on foundations we might prefer not to examine too closely. As night settled over the vast territories that had been reshaped by Mongol conquest, as merchants bedded down in caravanserais protected by the Khan's law, as scholars in Karakorum and Tabriz and Khan Balik studied under the same stars that had watched Genghis Khan's birth and death, the empire stood at its height. It would fragment eventually, as all empires do, the unity maintained by the great Khans giving way to independent Khanates that would develop their own characters and destinies.
But the connections forged during the century of Mongol dominance would persist, the trade routes and cultural exchanges and genetic intermixing creating a more integrated world than had existed before. Whether this integration was worth the price paid for it is a question each person must answer for themselves, knowing that the blood and the bridge are inseparable, that Genghis Khan's legacy is both the connection he created and the destruction he unleashed, two faces of the same terrible and transformative vision. And as this chapter closes, as the great Khan's body lies in its unmarked grave somewhere in the mountains of his birth, as his descendants rule from the Yellow Sea to the Danube, as the empire he built reshapes 3 continents, we are left with the weight of what one man's ambition and genius and ruthlessness can accomplish, for better and for worse, forever changing the world in ways both magnificent and monstrous, leaving us to grapple with the consequences centuries after the hoofbeats have faded into silence.
The Mongol Empire, vast and unified under the early great Khans, could not remain whole forever. Empires are like living things, born, growing, and eventually fragmenting as distance and ambition pull at the seams. By the middle of the 13th century, the cracks were already visible, hairline fractures in the unity that Genghis Khan had forged and his immediate successors had maintained. The Karatais that elected each new great Khan became increasingly contentious, family branches competing for supremacy, old grievances surfacing, the question of who truly held paramount authority growing harder to answer with each generation. The empire didn't collapse suddenly, didn't shatter in a single catastrophic moment. Instead, it slowly, almost gently, separated into distinct realms, each ruled by descendants of Genghis Khan, but increasingly independent in practice. The Golden Horde emerged in the Russian steppes in Eastern Europe, Mongols who ruled over Slavic populations and gradually adopted elements of Islamic culture while maintaining their military traditions. The Ilkhanate formed in Persia and the Middle East, where Mongol rulers eventually converted to Islam and patronized Persian art and literature, creating a hybrid culture that was neither purely Mongol nor purely Persian, but something new. The Chagatai Khanate controlled Central Asia, the heartland of the old Silk Road, sometimes fragmenting further into smaller units, sometimes reuniting, always reflecting the turbulent politics of the region. And in China, Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, established the Yuan dynasty, becoming emperor of China in the traditional sense, building a capital at Kanbalik that would later become Beijing, ruling over the most populous and wealthy portion of the divided empire. Each of these successor states developed its own character, adapted to local conditions, and navigated the challenge of being a Mongol minority ruling over much larger conquered populations. Some did this more successfully than others. The Yuan dynasty in China, despite Kublai Khan's considerable abilities and his genuine efforts to be a Chinese emperor in addition to a Mongol Khan, never fully overcame the divide between rulers and ruled. The Chinese elite, with their ancient traditions of bureaucratic governance and Confucian philosophy, never truly accepted these foreign conquerors, no matter how much the Mongols adopted Chinese customs. The dynasty lasted less than a century before being overthrown by native Chinese rebellion, the Ming dynasty rising from the ashes and deliberately erasing much of the Mongol legacy. The Golden Horde lasted longer, maintaining control over the Russian principalities for more than 2 centuries, extracting tribute and occasionally intervening militarily when submission wavered. The psychological impact on Russia was profound and lasting, creating a national consciousness shaped by subjugation, by the memory of being conquered and ruled by outsiders, a trauma that would influence Russian expansion and paranoia for centuries to come. The Ilkhanate in Persia eventually collapsed into warring factions, but not before presiding over a remarkable cultural flowering, the Mongol rulers becoming patrons of Persian literature and art, commissioning histories and supporting scholars, demonstrating that the conquerors could become cultivators of the civilizations they had nearly destroyed.
But even as the political unity fractured, the legacy of connection persisted. The trade routes that the Mongols had secured and protected continued to function, though with diminishing safety as central authority weakened. The Pax Mongolica, that brief window of perhaps a century when a single imperial authority guaranteed safe passage from East Asia to Eastern Europe, created patterns of exchange that didn't immediately disappear when the empire fragmented. Merchants who had grown wealthy trading along these routes continued to travel them, accepting increased risk because the profits justified it. Cities that had become nodes in this vast network, Samarkand and Tabriz and others, remained important commercial centers. The habit of long-distance trade, once established, proved difficult to break, and the knowledge that had been exchanged during the period of Mongol unity, the technologies and ideas that had flowed along protected routes, could not be unlearned. The genie was out of the bottle. Europe, which had been on the receiving end of Mongol terror when Batu's armies swept through Poland and Hungary, was also on the receiving end of Mongol-facilitated exchange. The technologies that traveled west during this period would transform European civilization in ways that contemporaries could scarcely have imagined. Gunpowder, which the Mongols had encountered in China and used to devastating effect in their sieges, made its way to Europe by the 14th century and would eventually render medieval castle warfare obsolete and shift the balance of military power toward those who could master cannon and firearms.
The magnetic compass, also originating in China, reached European sailors and navigators, making possible the long-distance sea voyages that would define the age of exploration. When Portuguese and Spanish ships eventually circumnavigated the globe, they were using technology that had traveled the Silk Road under Mongol protection. Printing technology, which existed in China centuries before Gutenberg, influenced European development of movable type, which in turn enabled the spread of ideas during the Renaissance and Reformation. Paper money, accounting systems, advanced astronomy and mathematics from the Islamic world, all of these crossed the Mongol territories and contributed to the awakening of European thought that would help end the Middle Ages. The irony is thick enough to taste. The Mongols, often portrayed in European chronicles as barbarians and devils, were the unwitting midwives of European advancement, the destroyers who nevertheless connected civilizations in ways that ultimately benefited the very cultures that feared them most. This was never their intention. Genghis Khan didn't conquer to spread enlightenment or facilitate cultural exchange. He conquered for power, for revenge, for the security of his people and the expansion of his authority. But intentions matter less than consequences, and the consequence of creating a unified political space across Eurasia was an exchange of knowledge on a scale the world had never seen. Yet the Mongol routes carried darkness as well as light, pestilence alongside ideas. In the 14th century, perhaps originating in the steppes of Central Asia or the trading cities along the Silk Road, a plague began to spread. The Black Death, as Europeans would call it, traveled along the same routes that merchants and goods had traveled, carried by infected fleas on rats that hitched rides in caravans and on ships. The pandemic reached Europe in 1347 and within 5 years had killed perhaps a third of the continent's population, entire villages wiped out, cities half-emptied, social structures shattered. The plague eventually spread across 3 continents, killing tens of millions, a catastrophe that rivaled the Mongol conquests themselves in its death toll. And it was made possible by the very connections the Mongols had created, by the unprecedented movement of people and goods across vast distances, by the trade routes that brought prosperity and also brought death. This is perhaps the ultimate symbol of the Mongol legacy's ambiguity. The same networks that carried silk and spices and knowledge also carried disease. The same imperial system that protected merchants also facilitated pandemic. Connection is a double-edged sword, bringing both benefit and catastrophe, and the Mongol Empire wielded that sword with unprecedented reach and power. The genetic legacy Genghis Khan left behind would remain hidden for centuries, invisible to the people who carried it in their very cells, waiting for modern science to reveal it. In the early 21st century, geneticists studying Y chromosome lineages across Asia made a startling discovery.
A particular genetic marker appeared with unusual frequency across a vast geographic range, from the Pacific coast of Asia to the Caspian Sea. Statistical analysis suggested this marker originated from a single male ancestor who lived roughly 800 years ago and who had an extraordinary number of descendants. The timeline matched, the geographic distribution matched. The most likely explanation was that this genetic signature belonged to Genghis Khan and his immediate male relatives, his sons and brothers, men who ruled over vast territories and had access to many wives and concubines, whose descendants in turn held power and privilege that allowed their lineages to proliferate. Today, roughly 16 million men, about 1 in every 200 males alive, carry this genetic marker. It's a biological monument more enduring than any statue or building, a living testimony to the reach of the Mongol Empire, written in the DNA of millions who may know nothing of their distant ancestor. Some of these descendants are concentrated in the former Mongol territories, in Mongolia itself and across Central Asia, but others are scattered across the globe, the result of centuries of migration and intermixing, carrying fragments of the conqueror's genome to places he never could have imagined.
This genetic echo raises questions that are both scientific and philosophical. What does it mean to be descended from someone like Genghis Khan? Does that legacy carry any weight, any significance beyond the merely biological? For most who carry the marker, the answer is probably no. They're farmers, teachers, merchants, engineers, living ordinary lives in the 21st century, as far removed from the 13th century steppes as it's possible to be. The DNA they carry is just information, just chemistry, with no necessary connection to character or destiny. And yet there's something haunting about the idea that the man who reshaped the world left traces not just in history books and archaeological sites, but in the bodies of millions, that his biological legacy is as vast as his political one, that in this most intimate and inescapable way, he altered the human population itself. The tomb that holds his physical remains, wherever it lies hidden in the mountains of Mongolia, has never been found, despite numerous expeditions equipped with ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery, and the determination of archaeologists and treasure hunters alike. The secrecy his followers created has endured for 8 centuries, a final privacy granted to the man who lived so much of his life in public violence and spectacle. Perhaps it's fitting. Perhaps the universal ruler who conquered so much and connected so many deserves to rest in a place no one can reach, where the world he transformed cannot disturb him. There are legends, of course, stories passed down through generations, whispers about the location. Some say he's buried beneath a sacred mountain, that the spirits of that place guard him still. Others claim the burial site shifts, that supernatural forces prevent its discovery, that the earth itself protects its most terrible and magnificent son. These are just stories, the kind humans always tell when confronted with mystery, but they speak to the mythological status Genghis Khan has achieved, transcending history to become something more like legend, more like the heroes and monsters of ancient tales than a flesh-and-blood man who lived and died like any other. In Mongolia itself, his legacy is complicated and constantly evolving. For decades under Soviet influence, acknowledging Genghis Khan's importance was politically dangerous, seen as promoting nationalism. After Mongolia's democratization in the early 1990s, there was an explosion of Genghis Khan-related culture, his image appearing on currency and vodka bottles, statues erected, his name given to the international airport. He became a symbol of national pride, of a time when Mongolia stood at the center of the world rather than on its periphery, when Mongol law and Mongol power shaped the destiny of nations. This modern embrace is selective, celebrating the unification and the empire building, while downplaying the massacres and the destruction, which is how nations always handle complicated founders, remembering what serves the present and forgetting what doesn't. For the rest of the world, the memory of Genghis Khan remains split between admiration and horror.
Military historians study his campaigns, marveling at the tactics and organization, the ability to coordinate armies across vast distances, the innovations in siege warfare and communications. Scholars of globalization see him as an early architect of world systems, someone who understood before almost anyone else that power in Eurasia required connecting rather than isolating, that controlling trade routes mattered as much as controlling territory. But others, particularly in the regions that suffered most under Mongol conquest, remember primarily the destruction, the cities that vanished, the cultures that were broken, the incalculable loss of life and knowledge. Both memories are legitimate, both are true, and perhaps the most honest way to understand Genghis Khan is to hold both in mind simultaneously, to refuse the simplification that makes him either a visionary hero or a genocidal monster, to accept that he was both and neither, a human being of extraordinary capability who used that capability to reshape the world in ways both magnificent and terrible, whose legacy includes unprecedented connection and unprecedented carnage, whose story teaches us that progress and destruction are often different perspectives on the same historical process.
The world Genghis Khan made is the world we still inhabit in ways both obvious and subtle. The political borders he drew have long since been redrawn. The empire he built has long since fragmented and disappeared, but the fact of connection remains. We live in a globalized world where goods and ideas move freely across continents, where what happens in one corner of the earth affects every other corner, where isolation is impossible and everything is entangled. This is the Mongol legacy writ large and extended through technologies Genghis Khan never imagined. The jet airplane and the internet are just more efficient versions of the Mongol postal system, ways of moving information and people across distances that once seemed unbridgeable. The global trade networks that connect Chinese factories to American consumers to African resource extraction are descendants of the Silk Road that the Mongols protected. We are all living in the connected world that the Mongol Empire pioneered, whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not. And now, as this story draws to its close, as the hoofbeats that began on the steppes 8 centuries ago finally fade into silence, we return to where we started, to the grass-covered plains of Mongolia, to the endless sky that Genghis Khan's people worshipped, to the wind that carries voices across impossible distances. Somewhere beneath those grasslands, in an unmarked grave that no one has found, rests the man who was born Temüjin and became Genghis Khan, who survived abandonment and slavery and captivity to unite a fractured people and build an empire that connected the world. His bones are dust now, returned to the earth from which all things come and to which all things return. But the consequences of his life continue to ripple through history, shaping the world in ways both visible and invisible, a testament to the power of a single human life to alter the course of civilization, for better and for worse, forever. As sleep approaches now, as your own day ends and this story releases its hold, carry with you the understanding that history is never simple, that the figures who shape it are never purely good or evil, that the world we inherit is always built on foundations both beautiful and terrible, and that perhaps the greatest wisdom is learning to see both, to hold contradiction without resolving it, to accept that life and history are complex beyond any easy judgment. The steppes are silent now. The empire has fallen, but the connections remain, woven into the fabric of our modern world, invisible threads linking east to west, past to present, the 13th century to our own. And you, having traveled this journey through time, having walked alongside the boy with the blood clot as he became the universal ruler, having witnessed conquest and connection, destruction and creation, can now rest. The story told, the night deepening, the weight of history settling gently around you like a blanket, warm and heavy, pulling you down into sleep, where hoofbeats echo only in dreams, and the past releases you to the quiet darkness and the peace that follows understanding. Sleep now. The story is finished.
The world Genghis Khan made continues without you for a few hours while you drift away to wherever the mind goes when the body finally rests. And tomorrow, when you wake, that world will still be here, still connected, still carrying the legacy of a man who died 8 centuries ago, but whose vision, terrible and magnificent, changed everything and continues to echo through the ages, a reminder that what we do matters, that history is made by humans, and that the consequences of our choices, like ripples on water, spread farther than we can ever imagine, touching shores we'll never see, shaping futures we'll never know. Good night.